titled Managing and Documenting Multi-Brand Design Systems. So probably don't have to introduce myself twice. I can see that actually most of you stayed for this talk, and I'm very grateful for it. Thank you very much. I hope that you will enjoy this. I try to make it as engaging as possible in a topic that is extremely complex. So excuse that some of the things will be a bit simplistic because we simply don't have time to go dive deeper into the design systems, multi-branded design systems. I will still try to put as much of interesting information for you forth as possible. So first, as I mentioned, what will you learn in the next 2 hours? I will video a little bit of theory, maybe 20, maybe 30 minutes behind design systems, behind multi-branded design systems, what they are, when they are actually a good choice. And I would say very light guide to starting a multi-brand design system, because as I said, if we would go into depths of this, we would actually need the entire span of the conference, I think, just to touch the basics. So we will see what we can do. And then there will be a practical part. I wrote 90 minutes, but I actually think we can do it in 60. And then we will have quite a bit more time for answering the questions, or I can show some extra functionality of Supernova, which there will be, but you will not see it on the demo because I just couldn't fit it into it. In the practical part, you will know how you can set up a multi-brand environment in Supernova. You will learn how you can manage your components, for example, your tokens, your guides, and so on. And primarily, you will also learn how to structure the documentation. This is, I think, the most interesting part because it is something that a lot of teams struggle with. And it's sort of cascade of the problems, right? They struggle with managing the design system data, and then they manage to create the documentation in the first place, and tooling is not there. And then you sort of compound this and overlay this with the problem of actually managing this in multiple dimensions, which would be your brand. And as you will see, the approaches to multiple brands are actually quite different. Finally, I would also like to touch on automation. There is quite sophisticated automation in Supernova, and because it is very deeply connected with the multi-brand environments, I would also show you just a little bit how you can deliver your styles and assets for each brand separately in this workshop as well. So let's start with, again, as I like to, maybe framing a context a little bit, and start with just figuring out what the challenges especially large companies, but I'm sure every company out there struggles and are currently facing. So what all companies have in common? I think the first one is definitely you are always driven by the cost and time to deliver, right? You can be a good Samaritan and so on, but if you are really doing business, everything costs you something, and actually in terms of money, but I would say the bigger problem is the time that it takes to, say, deliver your features, new products, or to stay competitive. So all companies struggle that is universal across all scales. I think if you are building a product that is customer facing, and I know this very well because we are doing that in Supernova, you really must be also very consistent with how you are presented to a market, right? And I will talk about Coca-Cola and mention them as an example. But think about Coca-Cola for a bit. What I mean by that is that they almost universally have the same brand across like all the nationalities and so on, right? And that is because they are sort of staple of bubbly drinks, and they've built it basically on a brand. Now, if you prefer some other drinks, this is not an ad. I just used something that everyone knows. But all companies also have to be very flexible with the changes, right? You need to be able to react to what market is doing. And I've actually talked about this at the beginning of this talk, sort of unintentionally. But you have this matrix where you can see that you can be flexible, and it costs a lot of money, and or you can be very good in presentations, but again, it costs a lot of money. Making a good presentation on multi-brand is insane. So all of those challenges compound, and it creates for quite a bit difficult times when companies are just going into the market or are on the market and needs to stay on brand. In large companies, this is a little bit, I would say, exploded by the fact that in many cases they have multiple products, they have multiple brands. It can be brands that are very different from each other, but it can be also the very same brand. Like think about Google, for example. Almost all their products actually pretty much share the brand. They change the logo, they use Material UI, and of course there are some nuances to this. But Google is a very good example of doing a multi-brand, but actually in very same environment. So the larger companies have different problems than the smaller ones, and it's just a huge mess. Definitely something that is very difficult to solve, especially if you're doing it for the first time. Now you can say that you haven't seen too many companies doing a multi-brand environment. You see this in the largest companies, definitely. What I actually want to show you on this image that you have definitely seen, that there is a lot of companies out there, and you might not even know about this, that are doing multi-brand. We will be talking about this with a little bit different context, of course, but on this screen, you can see that like the entire food chain, if you will, is basically controlled by very few conglomerates, right? And I don't know how many of those are managing their design systems and their products. Many of those are like completely disconnected from the core brand. But there is definitely a lot of companies that do struggle with this problem. And I think if you can manage that environment quite well, then you get quite a nice competitive advantage. So how many of you have multi-design systems already in your organization? That is a question for a chat, so it would be nice if someone chimes in. So now let's focus a little bit more on the design systems, actually. Let's not talk generic, but we are here for the design systems. So if we look at those brands that I was showing you, what if they used a multi-brand design system to manage all of this, right? What would be the advantages? Well, the first one that comes to your mind definitely is, if it's done correctly, and this is, this is, by the way, a very big if, then the efficiency is through the roof, right? You can literally save multiples of your development time just by having a very efficient system. This is ultimately the goal of all design systems, but it is magnified by the extra dimension of complexity that you have when you are managing the multi-brand. It is also true that if you create a design system properly, the multi-brand design system, then adding a new brand to that is usually quite painless experience. Doesn't have to be often. If you have looked at the logos that I've shown you, some of the brands are just completely disconnected, and so therefore you have to have a lot of customization. But if we talk, say, about white labeled solution and something that uses brands to basically represents those different white labels, then adding that brand is really easy. Maybe is as easy as adding a new style guide, right, that represents this brand, and maybe all the elements stay the same. So clearly much easier than creating an entire new design system that is not shared across all of them. Something that you will definitely appreciate if you are a business owner is that also if you unify your design, it's just better experience for everyone, right? And I think this is like a noble goal of creators of design systems. Efficiency aside, this is what a business owner wants. The creators, and what we do is we actually really care about our customers and even the internal teams of having a great experience. Design systems are good at that, and multi-brand design systems can be very good at that as well. And if you are really consistent with your brand, then usually you will see that your customers will actually really appreciate this. If we look at some good examples of really nice brands that I, for example, like Revolut or some other ones, you will almost always know that this is a product even of the company, even without looking at the actual product. And that's just because they have very strong brand and they are always on brand, which is very difficult to do if you don't have everything in tip-top shape. Of course, reusability comes down to efficiency. This is, I think, obvious. What are some of the biggest challenges of the design systems at scale, especially, but also in multi-brand? First of all, as you have seen in that spreadsheet that I was showing you, this was managing one brand, right? One design system. And already the data had like hundreds of dimensions. And so if you multiply that by, say, order of magnitude, which you need when you are creating a multi-brand, then you really need a very sophisticated system to manage all of this, because any inefficiency that you have created in the process will be magnified by the number of the brands, right? So having the management is of uttermost importance, and having the process in place that allows you to manage that is of uttermost importance. I think when I've talked with a lot of people about this, they mentioned quite a lot that structuring the design system, like actual concrete structuring of the design system to be just as flexible as they need, but also reusable, so it actually is good experience, has been one of the biggest complaints of all of them. So while on the process side, it's hard because you need to see a lot into the future and how you will manage this. When you actually sit in front of Figma and you are trying to figure out, the structure of your tokens and components, it seems that this is a struggle for a lot of people as well. And then I mentioned this, figuring out the right amount of flexibility. This is something that can really kick you in the butt. If you do a very rigid system, then it might be very hard for you to add a new brand. And then you have to say change 3 brands just to accommodate for the 4th one. But at the same time, this is something that I have very much personal experience with. If you are making too generic of a system, then usually you spend just too much time, maintaining that system, additional attributes that you might not need, and so on. So it's sort of both ways. Both are bad, and I would say the line where it meets and where it's really nice is very thin. Then there is, of course, all the standard stuff that you would expect. Documentation is hard because there needs to be more documentation. It's more sophisticated. Delivery is hard because you are not working with one target, but maybe like 16 targets as one of the companies that we have on board. And adoption, ongoing maintenance, and so on, the standard stuff that is inside the design system, again, all magnified by the scale of the problem. So how would you start with a multi-brand design system? I've created this very light 101 edition of a guide that you can follow to start a multi-brand design system. It's by no means exhaustive. It's just a few points. We would have to be talking for like next 2 hours, but let's quickly go through it. So I wanted to show you a few main approaches how multi-brand is done. There are many ways how people basically, I would say, structure the design systems, and also many ways how people think about this. But I think one of the closest one to how I think about design systems is what you are seeing here on the screen. So on the left side, you have something that apparently is called brand house, which is you have very strong core brand, and the sub brands are actually not deviating that much, right? And you've worked with all of those tools, so you can agree with me. All of those brands or all of those products that Google has have their own different brand, and yet they are actually really almost the same. And this is due to using the material UI, due to using the very same principles across basically the entire design language across very large company. The other one is the opposite approach, where it is basically a disconnected pool of brands, right? So P&G has some 3 brands. I know a few of them, but in reality, they are actually vastly different. If you would be looking at that brand, you would not say that they are from the same company, right? So not much is in common. And of course, design system will have to reflect that somehow. And then you have a hybrid solution, which is sometimes there are aspects of the core brand, but then the sub brands or the brands that are parallel to that can be quite different as well. This is actually quite close to House of Brands, but I would say the design systems, if we think about them, would be much closer together than in the case of the central piece here. Now, I don't think this split is actually true. I would have to disagree with the author, and I would love to have the conversation about this. But if we think about the design system, then again, this is my personal opinion, but what I have seen from the experience and from some of the articles from some of the leaders in this industry is something that I call basically three main approaches to multi-branded design systems. The first one is a system separation strategy. The second one is brand alignment strategy. And the third one is common ground strategy. Now, we collectively can name this however we want to, but I think the principles behind it are solid, and I've put quite a bit of thought into it. So I hope that you will enjoy this little bit of separation. So starting with a system separation strategy, TLDR of this is that each brand, and we talk, this is now about design systems as a whole, each brand has its own managed design system, right? I think this is one of the most natural ways how you get into managing multi-branded design system, because if you think about it, every company ever starts with one product, right? And so you are building one design system, and that design system grows over time. Your company grows as well. Maybe you add another product. Maybe you acquire a company, or any number of permutations, however you want to think about the brands and multi-branded design systems. And so you naturally will start another design system for for the other product or for other brand. And then as you scale the company and as you scale your offering, maybe you will have 2, 3, 4 design systems that are sort of working in parallel to each other. Sometimes there is a little bit of overlap. Maybe you share the people who are managing the design system, but there was no unifying step just yet for this design system. So I think the system separation is actually more common than you think. And I would argue maybe for companies that do have design system, but actually don't want to go through like rebuilding the design system to be truly multi-platform, this is probably something that they would have. Of course, this approach has the most flexibility of all of them because you are not constrained by anything, right? You are basically just managing multiple design systems. It comes with a cost, of course, and that is because there is no overlap, it has the biggest overhead. And so each brand basically adds and incurs another cost to management of that design system. So it can be that you have teams of people managing those design systems. You know how painful it is to manage one. Imagine that you have 5 alongside each other, right? So at that point, you would start thinking, hey, isn't there some better way? The other approach to the design system is something that I call brand alignment. Now, this goes a little bit beyond design systems because in order for this to work, you actually need to change your brand of the company. Now, in many cases, this is not viable from a business perspective. But when I was doing research for this talk, I've actually found a few examples of this, and I will share them with you after the talk. But basically, the whole point of this is you identify what can be aligned, and that alignment then becomes a sort of base for your design system, right? So you will say, okay, maybe our brands are diverging in terms of styling, in terms of tokens, in terms of spacings, for example. But you will say it is actually fine for our brand if the spacing would be united across all of them, right? And you will remove the complexity by basically replacing the spacings, the same spacings for each of the brand. Now, this requires a lot of buy-in from the company management. Usually, it is company-wide thing always when you change a brand. So this is probably the most difficult one to truly get going. But in some cases, it can work, especially if your brands are close already. I think you can actually get to a point where they are really almost the same. They still feel visually different, but it sort of works. The honorable mention here is white labeling. I would say that white labeled application, if they are managed as design system, which means it has to be really very sophisticated white labeled solution, then those would probably fit into this category as well. And finally, the third one, I wanted to share this this quote that I don't know who to attribute to, but if you are the creator, this is a really nice quote. A multi-brand design system is all about sharing, and it is not. It must not weaken the brand or their products. I think this happens even in non-multi-brand environments, where you sort of bend the brand around the design system. And because the multi-brand design systems need to be bent even more, you are bending the brand even more, but you are weakening it, right? You really want to stay true to your brand. And so it is important when you start with a system like this, that you actually take care of it and that the brand stays, unless it is sort of a good choice to make it such a change. So with that in mind, I want to talk about the common ground approach, which is, I think, the most difficult one to do correctly, but I think it's also the most rewarding in most of the cases. And it is also something that you will see on the demo. So TLDR is that you basically identify the shared parts of a design system, and then you also identify what is unique for each brand. I will go in depth, but I just want to say that because it is the most difficult to do correctly, it usually takes quite a bit of time to get going, but has potential to bring a lot of costs because it has sometimes the right amount of flexibility that it gives you in terms of creating the design system, but it also gives you, I would say, quite a lot of savings in those core tasks that you are doing over and over for all of the brands, right? And it is still something to keep in mind. In this solution, it is still easy to add a new brand, even if you say need to diverge a little bit. So what are main phases of this common ground approach? This is the last part of this theory of the talk. And then we will go to a demo and I will show you bits and pieces of this in practice. But the main phases of the common ground approach are important from just a intellectual perspective, I would say, to know, to wrap your head around when you are starting a multi-branded design system. So number one, do a research. I think a lot of companies start with a design system and with this idea, and then they will basically start thinking about how to use that design system in their company. This is completely wrong, because with multi-brand design systems, it is actually really hard to bend that system so it fits, across very different, in many cases, brands. So research at the beginning of uttermost importance. You should take all the brands and analyze them separately, find the UX, UI patterns, every concrete thing that you can have, how you are using your colors, how you are using your component libraries, whether there is documentation, what can be shared, and so on. And one thing to note here, this is more human work than it is procedural work, I think. So you have to talk with people. You have to talk with the people who are using those brands and figure out what is important for them, right? Because this is the flexibility window that you will have. There can be a lot of pushbacks from users to start using your design system. If you find something that actually fits into a very narrow window that they are doing, then you will have much easier time building something as sophisticated as multi-branded design systems are. One last thing, in the research phase, definitely identify what makes the brands unique, because this is the piece that you usually cannot move with, right? If there is something like I don't know, something really simple like a logo, of course, that is a bad example. But if everyone cares about that logo, there's no way that it's going anywhere. So you have to accommodate for that. And it is really important to do that identification. Number 2 out of 5 is find a convergence and divergence point of, especially in the design that you have done, but also in the component libraries that you can leverage to your advantage. Now, this is not exactly a great example of what I've put here, because it shows already existing design system and basically a produce of your research into the design systems, but it actually illustrates it quite well. So you can see that I was able to be convergent in text and in error. They basically both share the same, but then primary color is very different. So it means that my design system will actually be probably driven by the styling, right? And there is a lot of pieces of information like this within or across the entire process. So everything from colors to typographies to styling as a whole, to components, to documentation, you can always find what is already in place, what you can move with, or what you can actually exchange, or maybe it's flexible to be changed, or it would be such a small change that it would actually help you a lot in terms of building the design system, but no one would notice at all. And this happens also quite often. There is a lot of extra stuff that is sometimes not needed in brands, and building a multi-brand design systems gives you a very unique opportunity, in many cases once in a company lifetime, to sort of cut into it and make something really nice, really succinct. Number 3, we've already talked about this, so just very quickly, identify and build common styling library. You can argue that maybe starting with components and so on is important, but I would say the styling is always what you present to the users. And it is also something where you probably can find the most savings. There will be always something that you can unify. And once you have the base building blocks of the styling, then you can start think about how your components should look like. Everything from how they should be styled to how you should design your interfaces, right? And how generic those components need to be. So I think styling actually makes logical precedent. I'm sure there are many exceptions, and maybe some of you have different experiences, personal experiences, how this was done. But it gives you a nice framework that you can then use to work with components later, which are objectively much more difficult to do correctly. 4, and next to last, is build a reusable component library. Once you have identified your convergence and divergence points, you will know what is your sort of frame of reference where you can be moving with the design system. And within that frame of reference, you will create components that give you just the right amount of flexibility for actually applying, say, the styling or something unique about the brand. So how would you approach creating such a library? I'll show you one really nice example of how this can be done. But in general, I think you start with atomic principles, right? So you always create atomic components, maybe buttons, checkboxes, and so on, that will be shared across all the brands. And then you will use those components to build something that is maybe a bit unique for your brand. So for example, if you have a library of 50 components, they are all those core components, so they are not made out of other components, then you can have this Lego and you can build very sophisticated interfaces out of them, right? And they can form components that may be shared across design systems, but may be different in implementation. So this actually gives you quite a bit of flexibility again, and flexibility is what is very important in multi-branded environments. And so if you create flexible enough core components that are easily styled and so on, you can actually benefit quite a lot from having a package like this. Excuse me. It is surprisingly hard to talk for more than an hour, but I'm sure we will make it happen. So I was talking that there is a good example of this, and I definitely recommend you check them out. They even written an article about some details of how they are doing multi-brand design system. It's Harry's, and they call their design system Forge, or actually it's sort of more sophisticated than design system. I actually really liked their concept. And in here, you can see two sort of distinct brands that have shared common elements, and you can definitely identify them just by looking at it visually. Yet the brand somehow feels completely different, right? And I think this is what you want to get to when you are building a multi-branded design system. You want to have something that is really flexible, that you can style, but then if you really need to go and change something, the system is again flexible in this direction as well. And if we look at it visually, you can see it here. For example, this component and this component actually shares the same design system component. I know this because you will see code of what goes into those components very soon, but they are styled differently, right? And they have different options. And finding this balance is really, I think, the most critical part of building a design system. Now, if we look at how they do this in a code, and it will illustrate this very nicely. I've put the code representation here as well. This is a bit more nerdy, so excuse me. But you can see that one of the checkout experiences is using a pop-up button, and the other one is using a sidebar, right? So the navigation will be different. But actually, they share a lot of common elements. So, for example, the heading is the same. The cart products, again, the very same. And it even has the very same interface. So the components are actually inheriting the styles automatically, which is amazing, because then it makes it much easier to use that. Like, you don't have to track constantly information about how you should be doing the styling of the components and so on. Very nice system, and you can see that it can be done in very clear way. Of course, making it properly requires a certain mastery that I think comes with experience. So number 5, and the very last thing that is important to mention, is documentation. You will all agree with me that a design system is all about its documentation. It is why we have, as Supernova, invested into basically recreating a Notion experience and then something on top of it, right? And believe me, that was not an easy task to do. And I think we are still some way of making the experience as great as in Notion, though we are getting there very quickly. And I think if you look at what documentation entails in terms of the multi-branded design systems, then it is 2 parts, and we will illustrate that on a demo. There is some shared part where you will basically share everything that goes into all of the brands and should be shared, right? So design system guidelines, how you should start with the design systems, things like installing the libraries, for example. How do you work with design system? How can you contribute to a design system? All of this will probably be shared, and those processes will be the same because the design system is managed as one unified entity. You will probably also share principles behind UX. That is, of course, debatable. You can have very diverging brands, and then UX principles might be different. But I think talking about what we've been explaining, that you should start with the styling and then apply them to components, you will be in the shared category. And of course, because I've said that you should be building a core component library, usually shared will be also core component documentation, right? So it is ideal where all the brands share the components, and you can go to one documentation and then say, apply a style on a component and that style will rebrand the component, that would be amazing. And I will show you a bit of that on the demo. And then you have the brand specific. You cannot brand specific part of the documentation. You cannot really avoid it unless you are doing maybe the white labeled solutions. But even then, you usually need bits and pieces that are specific. So in here, you would probably find voice tone and maybe a specific design foundation. If you have built your multi-brand on top of the idea that it is fully governed or fully changeable through styles, and then this part will diverge quite a bit. And in many cases, there will be a lot of components, or say some components, that are not shared across the design systems. Each brand will always have something unique to them, right? Again, if you are not talking about white label solutions. And so usually we'll have some components that are shared across all the brands, but then some that are maybe built out of those non-branded components, but are specific to a specific brand. And actually, this example is really good, because those are two very different components, right? And they have very different implementation if we look at this, but they share all the common elements. And so we can consider this a multi-branded environment and a good example. So this is theory behind the multi-brand. As I said, this is just like multi-brand 101 in 30 minutes. But now I would like to I would actually like to ask whether we should do a first batch of questions, and then we can go just to break up the workshop to two phases, and then we can go to a demo.
I think that sounds like a good idea. All right, so let's see. There was a lot happening in the chat as well, but for now, I'm just going to check the Q&A that we have in the feature in Zoom. So let me go back a little bit further down. Oh, and also I see that your colleague Andrew is going around and answering some of the questions as well, which is very helpful.
He's a good storyteller, so that's always very helpful.
I mean, overall, like I have a personal question. Overall, when thinking about multi-brand design systems, it feels like it would be amazing to have one system to rule them all and just changing between the things. And I love the different approaches that you suggest to go about that. But what's your experience with like the products that you've seen that do use multi-brand? Is it like a very hard job to do, or like on a scale, like how would you rate this?
TLDR is, I think, one of the most difficult tasks in design systems. And as a concrete example, without naming a company, we have a company who was considering or is doing 16 brands, right? And that's a lot of brands. Like 2 are hard, 16 is objectively even much harder. And so for them, having a system in place is really important. And they've been talking about every aspect of that system, right? And some of the things we couldn't even support in Supernova, which is expected if you have something, so difficult. But fortunately, there is a lot of flexibility in how you can bend the Supernova around so it works with you. But it was still very difficult. And there was everything from process to how you manage tokens, how you manage the differences between tokens, how do you present this well to the users. Documentation, of course, being probably the most difficult part of all of this, because there are simply no precedents, I think, for how to do this correctly. I know that there is a lot of good examples, but I think it's the same problem as what we have seen with PayPal, right? The system is amazing. Like, don't get me wrong, we've been chatting about this with the guys in Supernova just in the meantime, and I was like, wow, this is awesome. But how much time did go into building something like this, right? That's unrealistic for most of the companies. So I think the biggest issue here is that the examples that you see are from very large companies that have very different internal processes and very different resources than most people. And so they simply don't work, right? We would love to have their sophisticated plugins but alas, we have to do with what we have.
Yeah, no, I think you put it really well, indeed. I do have an interesting question that is, I guess, a bit philosophical to do with multi-brand. So what would be a valid reason to disconnect a brand from your multi-brand design system?
I would say in this example that I was showing you, where there is, say, Coca-Cola, if you would have a lot of brands that are the same, but then one, or let me put it this way, there is always certain level of abstraction that you are doing, and so a certain level of flexibility that you are doing for your design system, right? And it is up to you how flexible do you want to do that system. But as I was saying, from experience, the more flexibility, the more time you actually spend managing, and the more time you spend building that system, right? So if you have 3 or 4 brands that are almost the same, and you can go by with just doing a design system that is okay and flexible enough, but then you have outlier, which adds a lot more flexibility, it is probably a good candidate to consider. And I think in there, the research about the convergence and divergence points is very important, because you can see that very clearly. If you have a lot of same brands and then one that is just not there, maybe you don't think about it as a multi-brand, and maybe you keep having its own life, and that's fine. Because ultimately, for a business owner, it is about cost judgment, right? And you should not be doing stuff ever that just incurs additional cost, but actually doesn't add you anything, which happens sadly more often than not.
Indeed. Oh, very nice. So we have a situation here. We're currently building a multi-brand design system with over 10 brands. The styling doesn't seem to be the issue just now. It's actually what content is displayed on each component. Our customers all have different needs and different ways of displaying their offering. So have you had any experience with that?
Yeah, so I think there are, again, few dimensions to this. Some are more concrete, like components, and having the flexibility to, say, when we tie it to the documentation engine, to show components in different variations, not go, say, beyond the storybook that you have, but actually be able to, say, write a live code. That was also a very nice demo that we had, and you will also see that in my demo. But again, I think it all comes down to having a flexible enough tooling in place, actually. And in here, I'm not saying the Supernova would be the solution, right? But I think many times, if you have something so sophisticated, you will end up building your own things for stuff like this, and you simply don't have enough resources to cover all the cases, right? So in many cases, it is about judging whether or not to go with a vendor, maybe for some things, and just to make it easier on yourself. I know that those sophisticated companies with very sophisticated design systems usually err on a side of we will do it ourselves, but then there is a lot of problems. And we can talk about this a little bit more, of course, one-on-one. Just ping me a message.
Yeah. Cool. You're definitely very available in our Slack. I see you guys
Yes.
from Supernova very active. Thanks a lot for that. And I think, we covered a lot of the questions, and Andrew as well went ahead and answered some more. So I think you can go on and continue with your workshop.
Yeah. So thank you very much for this break. I hope some of you went and got some water, or maybe did a bio break. Now we will do the actual demo of Supernova. And the focus of this is a little bit different than what you have seen last time. We want to build a multi-brand design system. Now, we have seen this as a problem, basically, with almost every company that we now talk with. If it's of certain size, they will come and they will say, well, we are maybe thinking about doing multi-brand, or what happens if we add a multi-brand, can you support this, right? And so we spent some time, actually quite a bit of time, building a native support for multi-brand into Supernova. It is surprisingly difficult because you can say, well, maybe you can do multi-brand as like a copy of everything, right? But that is not the case because there is a lot of overlap between those brands, and we would like to support the third option, which is something that I call the common ground, where you can have part of a design system which is shared across the entire company or across the entire design system, but then have something unique for each of the brands. And so what I want to show you today is a practical part of the workshop where we will do the following things. We will set up the multi-brand environment. I have Figma files here, and I have two of them. You can see that I have into design system brand A and also into design system brand B. Now, for I would say time-saving purposes, let's call it Brenda. As you can see, our brand A is called Brenda, and then let's call it brand B because that's really nice, and I thank our designer for figuring out that this is actually the case. So now we have two Figma files, and we also have a code that I have prepared in advance. There is one branded component, button from Brenda brand. Actually, maybe it's not that great. So there is a button from a brand A and button from a brand B, and as you will see, they are quite different. And so the first thing what you would do if you would start with the multi-branded design system inside Supernova is you would go and actually create the brands. Now, I've prepared several design systems for you, and we will use them for different purposes. But let's go to a multi-brand, which is our core design system that we will be building. And let's start making the documentation. Let's start making the connection to the components and tokens and so on. So the first thing, as you can see here on the left side, we have, as I said, native support for brands. So there is always a default brand inside Supernova. This is basically not very important for you if you are building a single brand environment, but if you are building a multi-brand, then this is extremely important, because if you have already created a design system, you can just naturally switch it into multi-brand environment, and then can save a lot of time. And I will show you exactly this. So if we go to edit the brands, you can see that there is one default one, but I actually want to see it renamed. So let's rename it to Brenda. And a description we don't really have to do for the workshop. And I will also create another brand. Now you can see that you have to opt in for brand functionality. I have already enabled this, but it basically switches some of the things on inside your design system, especially around documentation, as you will see. I will create the other one, which is brand B. And again, let's not put the description here. And now I have two brands. So far, I think everyone is following. This is not very complicated. And as you will see, almost everything when you manage the multi-brand environment inside Supernova is actually quite easy, or I would hope so. So let's go to content first. And I want my libraries to be available for me inside the design system, so I can pull from the elements, pull from the components, pull from the token pool, use it inside the components, let's say, use it inside the documentation. Very important part to mention here is that while there is a lot of overlap between the brands, in terms of what you are importing to Supernova, brands are considered separate objects. And there is very good reason for this, and I will explain this. So right now you can see that I have brand A, right? And I'll go to Figma. Our import is that easy. You just share the link. If it's private, it will tell you that you should log in with Figma. We have integration with them. I will just copy the link for myself. And I will go and link the Figma file here. So using the Figma integration, link Figma file, copy paste. I've also enabled automatic updates, which means that there is basically persistent observer of the changes that you are doing into Figma files. If you change a component, if you add a token, if you remove something, then we will know about this and we will synchronize it on your behalf. So now you can see that it has updated or imported all the data. It imported visual components that were there. It also imported all the styles. I will go through the design file and I will show you some details about it. And also some styles were ignored. We have this error system where you can see some limitations of Figma API. So for example, if it shows that some files are in files, but not used in the document, we cannot actually import them. Why Figma has done this like this, we don't know. But alas, if you want to use styles, they all have to be sort of put forth inside the design. So, which is why we are having the native styles here in those nice columns. So I probably don't want to skip this, so I will just explain what you are seeing here. It's standard design system library. Supernova works with design system libraries, and it will only pull data that you have published. We will not touch your drafts, and we will not touch changes that you have done since the last publishing. And this is for a good reason. Of course, we don't want to be polluting your core repository, which will be the Supernova. So this is why we are doing it in the first place. To describe what you are seeing here, some style information, basic palette, and then some semantic tokens that we also have. You can see that I have a primary brand here, and I want to bring attention to it because if we go to a brand A, I now realize the confusion that I caused, then you will see that the primary tokens are actually a little bit different, right? And again, going to brand B, this is the difference between our brand. And we have quite a bit more differences. For example, in this brand, we have this asset library, but in this brand, we also have asset library, although the assets look quite a bit different, right? And there can be extra assets for each brand as well. So it starts to compound. Now I see that you've shown your face, so I want to ask whether there are some questions.
I just wanted to make sure that it gets covered at this point. So we have someone who maybe got lost a little bit. So do they import brand B library to brand A?
Yeah, I would get to that. So let's first cover the structuring of the design systems. In my case, and what you will see for this demo, is the very easiest way how you can structure your design system for brands. Right, I have 2 Figma files, but you can substitute that with multiple design files if you like to, say, split your styles, split your components, split your icons. That's completely fine. Supernova will handle all of that. But what is important here, and I wanted to specifically make it one file, is to see the differences that you have in between brands. So I have a brand A, and this is the Figma file. By the way, we will be sharing all of those files after the conference, so you can go and test it yourself and you will have the recording, so you can just follow. There will be also probably some extra videos to explain. So what is the same inside the Figma files? Well, the color palette in my case is the same, right? And I've created the full color palette, so the designers have quite a bit to pick from, but maybe your palette will be smaller, and that's probably the case. Inside the brand B, I have the same color palette. And so this part will be shared across my design systems. If we look at some of the other tokens, however, you can see that the semantic primary colors are actually different in each of the brands, right? So we have the same tokens, there is still primary color, but they have different values. And so you would like to treat them as the same object. They just have different value depending on how you are looking at the design system and potentially also how you are exporting the design system, right? Because you want your data to be exported in branded version for one product and then in branded version of the brand P for another product. So this is a very important concept. We in Supernova basically have everything as like a semantic object. that object can have either a unique representation, which would be, say, something very unique to a brand, like this sales badge, or it can have shared representation, which is, for example, the primary token for green 0, because there is the same object inside the brand A and also inside the brand B. And when you import the data, we will know. Now, this works for everything, for components, for assets, for typographies, basically everything that you can put inside the design system library. Now, how does it work in practice? And this is the answer to the question that was asked. If we go to a brand A and I switch to a brand A, oh, I see what I did. I've imported brand B to a brand A. Well, that's unfortunate. Fortunately, what we can do is to say, I don't really want that design system file here. So I will just remove this and you can pretend that nothing happened. Now my design system is squeaky clean again. There are no tokens, no components or anything like this. And for the brand A, I will now import the correct one. So going back to Figma, selecting brand A and sharing the link, I can import this document into Supernova. So again, I will enable the automatic updates, link the file. I now realized my mistake and thank you for letting me know. What I will also do now, this import takes quite some time, but it's afterwards, after the first import, it's quite fast. And also it is always done in background, especially if you have the automatic updates enabled, so you never have to see this window again. So I've imported the brand A into Branda, and now I have 26 components added that I can work with, and also some 180 styles. That's quite a lot of styles. Honorable mention here, we've also imported assets. In Supernova, what you can do is if you select a component that you are using for your icons and you make it exportable, then we will know that in addition to you treating it potentially as a component, you should also treat it as asset. And with assets, you can do quite a bit more stuff, like, for example, render them inside the docs, have them downloadable, or even automate the delivery to your code bases, to GitHub, GitLab, Azure, or Bitbucket. Even now, I know that there is quite a few people that asked for Bitbucket support, so we've added this as well. So continuing then, let's prepare the second part of our demo, and that is the brand B. Again, going to Figma, linking the file, switching to a brand B file of the design system that we are building, and then copy pasting the link. It will go and it will import all of that information. Because we are now importing into two brands, what will happen is that our system will figure out what objects should be aligned together, and they will basically be created and presented to you as one semantic object. And I will give you an example of this. So now you can see in one design system, I have brand B. In one design system, I have brand A. I am sure there will be some question, though I cannot see it, whether you can add something that is shared, like a shared library between all the brands. And this is definitely the case. This is, after all, point of the common ground approach. So what you would have to do is to go to a Figma, and if I would have, say, a component library, which would be my core set of the components, then you would just go and import it individually into each brand that should adhere to that core set. And we will know that they are the same components, so they will always be treated as one component. It's actually a really nice and smart way how to do this, because it gives you a full control over how you structure your brands, right? There can be one file that you are managing for all the brands, and then maybe some additional files that are for styling, and then those can have variants, and those variants can be specific to a brand. There is a lot of variations how you can import this, but for the purposes of this demo, I want to show you the simplest one, and that is I have some copies of the objects inside my design system, but then I have some things that are unique for each brand. And this is also something that I will show you when we go to the documentation. So let's see that we've actually created something that is now linked together. And what better way to do that than just switching to a token and show you something visual. So in Supernova, you can import tokens from Figma. You can also create them if you want to. You can see that it's possible to create new tokens and manage them. But those with the Figma icons are directly linked to Figma, and they will be tracked and changed automatically if you have enabled that manual update. So how do I know that my multi-brand is working? First thing that I will do is I will select or I will search for a primary colors. And you can see that the primary colors are the purple and white, and this corresponds to our brand A that we have created, right? So this is the primary color palette that we have created. Now, if I go to a brand B and switch to it, and again, filter by the primary color, you can see that I actually have the same tokens here, right? They are still primary active background, primary hover, primary background, primary color. But if we switch between the brands, now with the filter applied, it is actually differently valued object. And this is very important going forward. And I will skip a little bit and show you one thing just so you have this mental model ingrained completely. So I will go to a documentation, and now because I have enabled the multi-brand environment, all the elements, all the blocks have the ability to actually use the branded information. I would say we would like to add a colors here, right? And just some primary colors that we have shown. What I can do is simply write /token and maybe select a specific group of tokens that I would like to track. So I will select from a color tokens and then select semantic primary group. So now I have all my tokens inside the documentation. This is of course not how it will look like when I deploy this documentation, because as I said, you can completely template how the documentation looks like, but I actually think it looks like it looks really nice, even by default. But specifically, so I've published the documentation, and we can view the documentation. So now if we go to styling and to the colors, you can see that I have some nice representation of those colors, right? But I wanted to bring and show you the main purpose of why we are doing the multi-brand. So what I can do is to say, show me the same data, but this time show me it with the different brand applied, right? And so just by switching this, you can see that basically the tokens are the same, but actually some of them have different values. In fact, all of them have different values. And what is also really nice about this is not only it changes the values, but if there are some tokens that are extra, or if there are some tokens that are missing from the brand, then this tracker, this automatic tracker, knows about this as well. You can see it that if we look at the structure should remain the same, but it does not, right? I can switch to a brand A, and you can see that this token in particular, just bring your attention to it, it will change, and it is different token. And that is because those two brands don't share that token. They have different one for each brand. So if I switch this, it's CTA primary active background. But if I switch again to brand A, it is primary inactive background. Just the token is no longer there, but we still know that from that group, from that palette that we've been selecting, there is basically information to be had that we want to show to the users. You can, of course, also selectively the tokens that you would like to show to the users, so it doesn't change. There is a lot more blocks for tokens that, for example, allow you to selectively say, I want to just show maybe a primary background color and a primary color and so on. But we will get to this in a few moments. So now you hopefully understand what I mean by that, that there is one semantic object, but actually the object is different, or the value of the object is different for each of the brand if there is a difference in that brand. And it can have the same representation if that object is shared across the brands. And this goes for every object. So if I would say spawn an asset. My assets are named the same across all the brands. So if we add all the assets here, just the entire core set of icons, we will render the components, render the assets for you, but you can actually see the assets in the second brand, right? So I will switch, it's the same object, but it has different value in the view that you are presenting to the users. This has to be set, and we will talk about this more inside when we actually start building the documentation. But you are always in charge of what brand gets shown to the users. And we will be very creative with this. We will use some tabs and so on to create a multi-brand, very nice multi-brand environment. But for now, I hope that you understand. Let me just give me just a second. I will look quickly through. Yeah, okay. I know that Andy is handling it. I was just looking whether there are some burning questions. So let's continue. Let's start building a. Oh, actually, do you want to ask something?
No, actually, I was here, and then you mentioned it, and I just clicked the wrong button. I think most of the questions are being covered, indeed, by your colleagues. There is also something to do with restricted stakeholder view for specific design system documentation. I'm not sure if you covered this already.
We can cover this when we get to the documentation phase, but in general, there are some things that we do support and some things that we have on our near short-term roadmap. One of the things is, for example, locking the certain aspects of a design system to a specific shareholders, as you said. But there are ways around this. And one of the ways how you can do that is we have very flexible export engine. And in fact, everything that you see here, when we publish the documentation, is actually export, right? There is very sophisticated templating language, basically, that allows you to produce a documentation. And some of the companies that we have actually created a documentation where we are basically distributing, like, say, 16 versions of the documentation to then, further processing to different domains and so on. And because you are flexible, it's just a JavaScript and HTML. Because you are flexible in this, you can set the filtering rules, for example, for what the brands should entail. So you can apply the tokens to a brand documentation, but then maybe show a different content for each one of them. It requires a bit of custom setup, but if you have, say, 16 brands, it's still much less than building that system yourself, right? So there is always balance, but I would say the true support for what the person is asking for is still not there yet. It will be. We have this as a request from a lot of people who are building the multi-brands, apparently quite common.
Cool. And in regards to the hex values, we have here, those colors don't have associations to the global color scale that were shown in the Figma. So does it support the token aliasing of things?
Yes. So this is one of the advantages of using Supernova over plain Figma. And I'm sure this is why people are also using design tokens plugin and so on. And we all pray to God that Figma will one day show a good solution for this, but that day is not there yet. And so we built a system for this. And so, for example, you can do this for Figma tokens as well. But if I would like to create a new primary token, I can not only create arrow value here, but through this link, you can actually link this to a specific value as well, right? So I would be able to link this. And the nice thing is that, of course, this supports multi-brand as well. We can also do mix-ins in terms of tokens. So if you have something more sophisticated, like say the typography, you can see that I didn't import the custom font, but I can fix that very easily. If I would create a new typography, then all of those attributes can be linked separately, right? So I could link a font as a partial, but then maybe a paragraph spacing that is shared across the entire design system, which of course in sophisticated design systems saves time, because if you change a green and it doesn't propagate anywhere, well, that's a toughie.
Cool. Yeah, that covered the question. Thanks. And can you demo how this would work with spacings, meaning different spacings in multiple brands?
Yeah. So I mean, there is also a category called measures, and you can create a measure token, which would be just a arbitrary spacing, be it say 12 pixels. So I'll use the default ones. You can also define custom properties for tokens. So if you want, say, different name for React, iOS, and Android, you can do that as well. And if we would create this like basic spacing, then this value would be creating as a general measure that we can use everywhere. And then say inside the typography, I can use this to say use a 12 pixel size, right? So now this works with the spacing, and every element that we have inside Supernova is connected like this if it makes a logical sense.
Awesome, thanks.
Of course, I think the other question was about the branded values. So if you then create the spacing token, you can create the same one in the other brand, and it doesn't have to have the same values, right? It can have a different value. So then the same thing as you can do with importing the Figma tokens, you can always do manually as well. In fact, there are some companies that are using Supernova to manage their tokens, and then maybe use our export engine to have basically the synchronization to the code. I know that some people will ask, so I will just answer this. And there is currently still no back propagation to Figma, but we are thinking about maybe supporting some common token managers that are there, because we do a lot of stuff that is extra that Figma cannot do, but there are definitely some plugins that can do that, right? So if we want to talk, let's talk about the conference.
Cool. And I think just one more. So, because of course, when we talk about tokens, we all want to follow the W3C standards and how the industry is moving that direction. So I imagine you guys also already thinking about this. And is it a functionality already that it can be exported to JSON, for example?
Yes. So you can definitely export all the tokens to JSON. In fact, I can show it to you right now. So we have this concept of exporters. Exporters are JavaScript and templating language combined packages, where you can basically define your own templates of how certain things should be exported. We have a store which is community driven. You can in fact go to each of the exporters, as we call them, and there is a GitHub repository associated to each one of those. But then you can also create your own ones, right? So you just write a bunch of JavaScript, and it's actually quite a bit less than you would expect to have a very powerful exporter. And the testament to how powerful the exporters are is the documentation exporter, because you can build your own documentation exporter, and then it basically works like Gatsby or some other tools that you would use normally to do a custom site. You can use the CMS of Supernova, but then you can also build a custom template that not only adds the styling information, but also adds the functionality to the editor, for example. It's very sophisticated topic. We don't have to go to that. But what I wanted to show you is that there is actually exporter to a style dictionary. What I would do, just install this exporter, and I can either invoke it manually. I would go to a build and create a new build. And you can see that we can even take a specific brand and then export this using that specific brand. So I would say export this with the brand B, and it will give me all of those overrides. And I would have to select the style dictionary exporter, right? So I would go next, and it would basically build a code that is securely stored inside Supernova. And you can download it, or optionally, and you will see this at the end, I can create more persistent connection, which is something we call hook. If we write a style dictionary here, We can be observing events inside the design system. Some events, for example, you release a new version, you change anything, which is quite fun if you have a lot of people. It like blasts your repository to oblivion. So use it wisely. But this one is actually the best, the one that I like the most, source updated. So it's watching your remote sources. If something changes, then it synchronizes automatically. And if you are using Figma, then this is a great choice. So I would use the source updated. I would select the style dictionary exporter, brand A or brand B, doesn't matter. You can set up multiple hooks or unlimited number of them. And then you would just select the destination of the delivery. And we have a lot of them. In fact, we have all the main tools, I would say, that you are using to manage the repositories covered now. So Azure, Bitbucket, GitHub, or GitLab, you would select one of those, select a organization you want to basically support, you would confirm this, and it creates a hook. You can see that the hook was triggered, and in a few moments I will get email that the style dictionary is actually in my repository. And if there is a change to my data, I will get a pull request again opened or actually appended to existing data. But again, with the branded information, and you can just continue. You want something else, you want again style dictionary, or maybe SVG assets, then you select a brand that you have, you name it, you select the event again, destination, there is quite a lot of options. And this way, there are some companies that have 16 brands, they have so many of those hooks, but it synchronizes everything, right, from one source. And this is ultimately what we want to achieve. We want to have all of your data at one place. We don't want you to be creating them inside Supernova, because there are much better tools for that, like Figma, like if you use Storybook, or tools like this. But we want to be centerpiece where you just import all the data seamlessly and it sort of works in both directions. So it is very complicated, but I hope this was quite extensive answer to this. Now let's continue with the demo of the multi-brand. Because we have quite a lot of in-depth questions, I will skip some of the things that I was going to show you and just quickly go through them. I've prepared three design systems that have all different documentation. And the reason why I've done this is to show you how you can structure your design system documentation. It took me quite some time, so I hope that you appreciate it, because building 3 design systems for multi-brand is a long process, even in Supernova. But if you switch to a multi-brand design, multi-brand structure design system, and again, we will hopefully make all of this public and you can try it yourself. Then if I go to the documentation, you will see a first approach to a design system documentation. And that is basically the number 1, complete separation of the docs. So you can see, by the way, just for a orientation purposes, if you see a header like this, this page is basically blend of both brands, right? It represents 2 brands. The brand B as a honeycomb is this one, and then the brand is this this thing over here. If you see an image that is just this, and then it's from brand A, and this is from a brand B, and you will see what I mean by that in a moment. It's just a nice visual clue, so you are not lost. So in this case, this is basically a complete separation of the documentation, something that I would strongly not recommend for you to do, because in Supernova, there are so many nicer ways how to do multi-brand. So you basically create a separate brands, as I was showing you, but then you also create a separate documentation and it maybe lives in the same design system, or it can actually live in a different design system as well. But it's not exactly useful, right? Because you lose a lot of that multi-branded functionality that we get for you by default. So if we just look at some of the examples, you can see that the styling actually has duplicates. So colors and typography are duplicated. And if you would have 16 brands, this is not really great. You would not be able to manage that, even with some things that we are preparing going forward. So this part of the brand is, I would strongly not recommend you to do. But if you want to, if you have just 2 brands, let's say, then of course you can manage those design system views yourself. Let's say if you want to finish just 1 page for a demo purposes, we use 2 main colors. So in here, I would add a primary color, a primary background, and also maybe a primary color. I will test that they have the branded variants just so very quickly. Yeah, so they have the branded variants. So I can I can copy this block, and then I can go to the branding B styling. I can copy this block, but then change the brand functionality, or using the brand functionality. So now the 2 blocks are different, but they are not really connected to each other, right? So this is not a great solution to a multi-brand. We can look at some other example, which is more advanced. And in some ways, you might opt for something like this. So in here, we have some overlap of the data already. We have the introduction page again, but this time you can see that the components from a brand A and from the brand B are in separate categories. So again, there are copies of the buttons, of the radio button, and you would have your 40 components. And I've seen documentations like this. There are reasons why you would do that. And that's usually if the buttons diverge so much, or if the components divert so much, excuse me, that they are basically not really documentable as a whole, because usually you want to document the overlaps and then highlight the differences, right? But if most of the page is different, then it makes sense to separate them. And this really depends on just your own personal experience. So if we go to the brand A, for example, you can see that this is a specific to this brand. I will show you how to create those nice previews very soon. But if we go to brand B, you can see that this is actually the same content, it just has different components associated with it, or a different code. Again, we will get to this very soon. Now, you can see that this would be appropriate, but I want to show you the common ground approach, which is the very, I would say, the most sophisticated and uses the most power of Supernova. So if we again switch to the multi-brand, you can see that now that we have imported all the data, I've actually went ahead before this conference and created a documentation that has everything described already, at least in a text. And we will just now use the design system elements that we have imported to basically represent the multi-brand and show it or create it how you would truly show it to the users. So let's start with the styling. You have already seen this. I'm quite proficient in this, so we can do it quite quickly. What I would like to show you, however, are some new blocks that you haven't seen yet. So for example, you can spawn a tab. And I think for a multi-brand environment, this is actually a really nice choice. So if you create a tab, you can of course create a tab as like a level page level object, but you can also create tabs within the design system documentation within any page. So I will call this brand A, and also brand B. And now I can write into those blocks the same way as I would inside the rest of the editor, but I can actually use those blocks to highlight the differences between the brands. So the main colors, if I would again use the list and search for the primary tokens, the primary background color, and then also the primary usual color, I will select this so it's a correct brand. And then I can copy this block and I can go to a brand B and duplicate this block, change the brand. It's very easy. All of the blocks support this operation. And now you will see that you have a tab where it shows brand A, it shows a brand B. And very nice functionality. You can actually, something that we have introduced recently, you can provide your own custom templates for how those blocks should be rendered, but you can also create multiple templates per one block. And what I mean by that is that there is this magical option that is that not many people know about just yet. And you can decide how you would like to render this on the front end. And you can contribute to your own blocks, even for the native blocks that are there in Supernova. This is something that I've contributed personally. So the pills basically will render the tabs a little bit differently than what you are expecting. And so now I will publish the documentation just so we know what gets created. I can also continue add the color palettes, just so you know, you don't have to do this like all the palettes manually, but you can actually say, you know what, render me all the palettes. So you would enable this nested group option and just render everything that you have inside the design system, right? And this is all tracked. So if it changes in Figma, it will change inside here. It will change inside your view. If you are using this in the components, it will change there as well. And of course, if you publish, it will change inside your documentation as well. So going into the component view, actually, we have to view it first and go to styling. You will see that we now have this very nice representation of the tokens, and I have an option to switch between brands, right? So I can see the brand A and brand B representation. I can see that this clips a little bit. We can fix that just by improving the template, and we'll do this after the conference. So this sort of shows you how we can be building a multi-brand, but now let's continue and actually very quickly do all the remaining elements before we get to components, which would be the last thing that I want to show you, probably the most sophisticated one. So again, I will quickly finish the typography. Again, adding a group of tokens, but this time selecting a typography. I want to show all typography tokens. And now I have all the typographies. I could create a tab and I could add those typographies to the tab, and then you can be switching between them back and forth, however you want to present this on a front end. Of course, if we switch in here into the brand A, you will see the custom font was not uploaded. I would have to fix that. But beyond that, you can see that the typography shares pretty much all the tokens, H1, H2, H3, but they do have different fonts, right? So this one is using the blatant bold, but this one is actually using interregular, and they would render appropriately on a front end. So, or on the documentation that you deploy. Next up, let's finish the resources. So in here, I would, instead of token, I would write asset. I would select the asset, and I want the core library to be shown in its entirety. There are some visual options that I can use, for example, to make the icons smaller. So let's maybe do that. We can also change some other aspects, but it's not very important. And then I can also decide what brand I want to show, right? So I can show brand A, or I can show a brand B. Or if you have multiple brands, you can select from one of them. And the objects that you would be using to then differentiate them would be probably tabs, either tabs to on a particular place on a page, or tabs that are basically a global level tab. I will show you what I mean by that in the component. So now, speaking about components, the very last thing that I would like to show you that we are doing, and that's probably the most important for you, is how to document components. So there are, I think, two main areas that we need to focus on. The first one is design overview of the component, right? And for that, you probably want to access your Figma components. You want to represent them in some nice visual way, maybe some previews. Well, we have a solution for this, even for multi-brand. So in here, first thing that I will do, again, I will spawn tab, but this time I will use the generic tab. I will create a brand tab and also brand B tab. And now I will use a new block that you haven't seen, which is a frame. Basically allows you to access any content inside Figma that you have available and that you have made available to the Supernova. Now it's worth noting that for the documentation specifically, you can be linking different Figma files than those that are supporting you with the data. And so you can be using, for example, a Figma document where you would be keeping your annotations and so on, but they will not be participating in the data itself, right? So if you have some extra tokens, they would not be imported. You can, of course, import both the data and the documentation's previews if you want to. Now, if I select this Figma frame, I've already imported the files that I would like to use the content from, which is the brand A and the brand B. So let's go to a brand A, and you can see that I have everything that I have in Figma accessible here as well. Now, I will just randomly select some components. I know how they are named, and I've tested this before. So in here, it will render me some assets. They are quite large, so maybe we can make them a little bit smaller. But it will create a good preview of those components. I probably, again, did this incorrectly. So let's delete this. Let's go to brand A and use the frames again. It's very easy. I will select the components from a brand A this time, of course, and generate, say, 4 components. Now I would switch to a brand B. And because I have access to both Figma files, I can actually draw from preview of both of those files. So I will switch to a brand B, and I will render from a core set of the brand B. And again, I will render 4 components here. So this time it will create me a different preview of those components. And now I have both the brand A and brand B visual representations of those components. And if I render them onto the front end, if I basically deploy them to my users, then you will see that they have this nice preview that you can be using throughout the documentation. It just takes a bit longer because we have connected the Figma files. So going into components, now we have the component overview, which is a main tab of the documentation page, but we also have a component variance basically showing here in both the brand A and brand B variation. So there is quite a bit more that goes into Figma, but looking at the time, and I know that this has been a long workshop, I want to show you one last thing, and that is synchronizing brands with code. And for that, we have a few standard things and then one non-standard, which you have seen on this conference before, but I mean today actually, but from some other company. And we are now making that functionality available to everyone. What I mean by that is that we actually have our own live compiler of the components. And so again, what I will do, I will spawn a tab, call it brand A and brand B. By the way, I strongly recommend that you just copy paste those elements. I really just want to drill down into you how you are doing this. But if I would be doing this over and over, I would be just copy pasting the same setup, especially if you have a lot more brands, because we are now working with 2, but it would be annoying. If you are creating the page level overviews, then we will actually ask you whether you want to spawn all the tabs for you, which is a nice small nuance that we have put there. But let's render the component. So the first thing that I want to do is to render a React component, like a live React component that is branded. We have this special block where you can just write a React. And as you will see, there is some preview of the live component and the React code that is associated with this, right? This is truly live. So if you just want to edit it, you can see that it live compiles on the front end. But we can bring a lot more than just basic React into it. So what I will do, I will go to settings of this documentation. And in here, you can see that I have JSON package. Now you can, or package JSON, you can put any kind of definition that is acceptable package JSON definition. And I have one here, which allows me to pull on the components that I would like to be using. So specifically, I want to import the material UI, some style library, and also the support for React bindings. I will copy paste this package JSON, copy paste it here. You can see that it was automatically saved. And now if I go to the documentation, not much will change just looking at it. But actually, I now have the full capabilities of Material UI and its associated libraries connected to my design system. So I can go, and I've prepared two branded definitions of the buttons that look sort of the same as from the brands that we have been importing. So here is a button number 1 from the brand button. This is a valid code. I just don't have the libraries associated with it in my Xcode, in my VS Code. And so if I go back to Supernova and I copy paste all of this code, then the compiler will take the Material UI button and it will style it properly. It will change all the attributes that you've put here, and it will actually render it on your front end. And I can do the very same thing in here. So again, if I put a React render block code here, it has the same configuration for the entire design system. I can go to a brand B, copy paste this code, and you will see that now I have the branded version, the second branded version of that button, right? However you want to approach it, it's probably supported because you can just be bringing React libraries, or as I said, the components, or with a little bit of tweaking, it is also possible to do Vue and Angular, and you can render them on front end. We of course have implementation of Storybook. So if you want to embed a Storybook story, that is all possible. But I would say for more sophisticated design systems, Storybook might not be sufficient alone. I think it's a great addition, but maybe you want to show something specific to your documentation. Maybe you want to show the multi-brand version of it. And then our React rendering definitely comes to play. Now, I'm saying this also because in addition to Storybook, it has one significant advantage, and that is it is tightly connected with Code Sandbox. And it is also tightly connected with our live compiler that we are using on the front end. So in the deployed documentation, you can actually go and edit live that code so you can see the changes on the front end as well. So if I'm a developer, I have this code here, I can copy paste it to my code base. Of course, I've put all my styles inline. I hope developers will excuse me, but you can pull that from, say, a styling library of Material UI or from your own library that you have created. But I can click this magical button which says edit code live, and that will enable the live mode basically for this widget, right? And so on the front end, I can edit this live. It is still being compiled. And so, for example, I can copy paste this button, and now I have two brand buttons, and one will be button and one will be brand button. So you can play around with your own libraries, with your own components on a front end, and you can modify them however you want to. And this kind of flexibility is really important for multi-branded design systems, right? Because that kind of flexibility is really hard to get if you have predefined stories in Storybook and so on. But in here, you can truly just with your developer code away, and we will just show it on the front end. Of course, this is live. The other one was not live, but I can go, I can edit the same, and I can, for example, change this or copy this button as well, just so you know that it works for every component. One last thing that I want to show you is also that there is Code Sandbox integration. Now, we are not trying to build another VS Code, right? So if you want even more sophisticated modes of presentation, then, or I mean, modes of editing of those components, then you can just click this button, open in Code Sandbox. It will save the state of this component, and it will actually show you the state of the component as you have edited in live, or if you haven't edited it, it will use the default component. So in here, of course, it is also live. We have this nice ripple effect. This has the same effect here, and this has the same effect here. It just has a different attributes. And you can see that any change that I do will actually make those buttons different. There is also undo stack, so you can go back and forth. It's quite a sophisticated functionality. So you have seen how actually very easily we can go and style or pull from different parts of Supernova. I haven't even shown you the components, but actually the new component functionality is also brand enabled. You can create components for each brand separately, but the properties between them, or the properties that you set up for a design system, are the same. You can, I can actually show you. So we could create, oh, my battery is low. I will have to connect it. But anyway, the button that I have created, I can also create in another brand, but we are not forcing you to have those buttons in both brands, right? Because fact is, in many cases, you need unique components in each of the brands. You also need different statuses, because maybe this button in this brand B is documented, but maybe this button in a brand A is actually not documented, and this is completely fine. So there is quite a bit more functionality that goes into that, but I will leave you to explore that yourself. One last thing that I wanted to point out, as I was showing you, there is the export functionality. We've already went through this, but I would strongly encourage you that you just play around with this. If you, for example, want to be delivering for one brand, which is Android and iOS only, then you can just say Android, iOS, create a hook for Android, iOS, and then maybe another brand do a tailwind or a style dictionary or whatever. You can combine them however you want to. But in order to show this properly, we would need another 30 minutes. I'm sure everyone is already tired. So I would very much like to thank you for watching.